Good morning. All right. We have 45 very short minutes to kind of review for the test and talk about what is coming up here in the coming week. I'll just talk a little bit about the next unit that's coming up here as you plan and prepare for testing on chapters 6 through 8. Officially, here are the pages that you're going to want to read for chapter 6. Chapter 6, right? Chapter 6 is going to be pages 107 to, I think it's 117. Okay, I cut it in half. It's really just focusing on the consequences of the French and Indian War. And I'll talk a little bit about the war itself, but really what the wars that we stop and we look at, they have to be good for something. If it's just violence, then it may not actually be historically significant. So the French and Indian War is definitely historically significant. So those are going to be the pages that you'll want to use for that. Let's see here. For chapter 7, and I'm trying to help you guys out as much as possible and not assigning anything that's above and beyond what the focus or the intentions of the APUSH exam are. For chapter 7, it's again only 10 of the 20 pages. It's going to be 117 to 128. Okay, chapter 8, another partial chapter. That'll be 135 to 147. Chapter 9, all. Chapter 10, all. Now, this is about 40 pages. This is only 30. Okay, and what I've done here is I've divided the content into basically the buildup and the consequences of the American Revolution. And we've really taken a lot of the American Revolutionary War out. We'll take some time to maybe watch some movies or some video that demonstrates Revolutionary War tactics and the military campaigns. But really what we want to look at is, why did 13 seemingly successful, happy colonies break away from the British Empire? And yes, I'm aware you know already, no taxation without representation. That's a big part of it. But to go a bit further in our analysis of the reasons for the American Revolution and the consequences. Okay, so once the colonies take this radical step to declare independence and break away, they enter a vacuum. Okay, for a moment there, they have no political government, no systems of government that they technically have to abide by. So how do they go from the state of anarchy, basically not having any government, to creating their own governments as a consequence of these revolutionary principles? Then the last 2 chapters are going to deal with post-American Revolution, right? So now that they've defeated England and established a new system of government, what challenges are there in that new system of government? Do you realize we're on our 2nd constitution? Our current constitution is the oldest constitution, oldest active constitution in history. But really, it's not that old, because we're not the oldest country in the world. But we made an effort in the first few years of the American Revolution to set up a constitution called the Articles of Confederation, and that collapsed. Okay, so we'll look at basically the decade and a half after the American Revolution up to 1800. And that is pretty much it for period 3. If you're thinking about it, if you do it mathematically, we have 8 periods in APUSH. And in 4 weeks, we'll be on to the 4th of 8. So we're moving along at a pretty good clip. Mr. Deerdoff said we're not moving fast enough. But I think seeing the smoke pour out of our ears as our gears burn quickly, I think we're moving fast enough, don't you? Yeah. I don't want to go any faster than the pace we're taking so that we actually absorb some stuff. Okay, so my recommendation is this, okay? 5 pages a night, 5 days a week. That puts you at 20 pages, right, a week, if you can keep that pace. So try to shoot for this by Sunday. That means next week, you've got another 10 pages, 5 days a week. That's only 2 pages by the next, the second Sunday. I think that's the 6th. Okay? You guys can all read 5 pages a night, can't you? I mean, if you keep that pace, things are okay. If you wait for 30 pages in 2 weeks from now, or roughly 13 days from now, that's going to be tough. Okay? So trying to pace it at a reasonable pace, but at the same time, there's not much room for procrastination. Questions about that? Okay, great. Thank you to those of you that came in this morning to ask a few questions about the content. Looking at the ed puzzles, it appears that we're at about 60% participation as far as finishing all of the ed puzzles. Okay, and that's okay. Hopefully those of you that are behind on that will catch up. I guess I do want to say this. After this test period, okay, we're almost at the quarter in the sense of that we just had our first progress report go out. If you are failing this class after this next test, I will need to be in contact with your folks and work with them to try to get you on the track to passing this, okay? And again, I think by and large, anybody that is failing this class, it's because work hasn't been turned in. And I don't want to take that step. I want you to handle your business as adults. And so my preference would be that you and I sit down and come up with a plan, and I could just tell your folks, hey, look, Mitch is taking the steps to, as an adult, to make sure that this is working. They realize that there's this progress that needs to be made. This is how we're going to do it, rather than saying, what do you think? Do we need academic detention? What do you think we need to do here? Extra hours. And then your parents start hand flapping and they go, oh my God, what is your problem? No weekends for you. That's not what any of us want. So be proactive about your education. Okay, so 35 minutes. What do we want to cover with this review? Yeah.
Could we maybe review which states had what religions and because I always get them mixed up.
Okay. What part do you get mixed up? The actual which has which, that type of thing? It's really, this is the easiest way, okay? Start with New England. New England colonies. So the question is, how can I keep track of the influence of established churches in the different colonies, right? We know the stories of the Pilgrims and Puritans in New England, all right? What are our New England colonies? It starts with Massachusetts, okay? Yep. What other colonies do we have in New England? What? North and South Carolina are not New England colonies. Okay, we'll put those over here in southern colonies. Maryland is actually a southern colony. If you recall, Maryland's the second colony to be established after Virginia on the Chesapeake. It's a Chesapeake colony. Let's see here. Maryland is MD. Okay. Pennsylvania, that's going to be a middle colony. How do you know? I'll tell you. All right. Anything northeast of the Hudson River, which runs basically north and south through New York. So anything east of the Hudson, not including New York. New York is going to be a middle colony. But anything east of the Hudson and northeast of the Hudson, we're going to call that a New England colony. And just as a point of information, when it gets to be the American Revolution, one of the first tactics that the British are going to take is to try to cut off the head of the serpent, so to speak. So much of the protest and violence and trouble with the American colonies had been in New England. If you think of the Boston Tea Party, that gives you a point of reference there. The English are going to try to push up and down the Hudson and seal off New England from the rest of the colonies. But Pennsylvania is a middle colony. Connecticut. Okay. Remember, we had the New Haven and the Hartford colonies. As Massachusetts grows and gets overpopulated, a lot of those Puritans file out into Connecticut and what's the other one I just said? What? Rhode Island is one. We'll talk about Rhode Island. Okay. What? New Hampshire. Yep. Vermont. Yes, Vermont will come later. Vermont right now is a territory of Massachusetts, and there's another one that's a territory of Massachusetts. It's way up there. What? Maine. Okay. Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Vermont. And if you remember, Connecticut combined the New Haven and the, what was the other one? What's the capital of Connecticut? New Haven and Hartford. There we go, Hartford. Those two are combined to be Connecticut. Okay, so there's our New England. All right, this should be easy. North Carolina, South Carolina, Maryland, already said Virginia, and we're missing one more. Georgia. Okay, so now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Means we need 4 over here. We got Pennsylvania, New York. Okay. Its partner, New Jersey. Okay. And little tiny, nope, Rhode Island's here. Delaware. Oops. Okay. Now, in the last unit, we talked about regional differences here, but to come to your religious one, right? We know New England was set up as what particular religious blend? Puritans, right? The Puritans and the Pilgrims. Pilgrims first in 1620, Puritans second in 1630. Both of these groups practiced what brand of Protestantism? They were all Calvinists. Okay, what's it mean to be Calvinist? They believed in predestination. How about church membership or political membership? What did you have to have in order to be a Calvinist? Or what? You had to have that conversion in order to be a member of the congregation. And this is where the word for the church comes. Okay? These folks, the Pilgrims and the Puritans, initially were part of the Church of England, right? The Separatists, the Pilgrims, known as Separatists, left the Church of England, tried to set up their own church, and King James kicked them out to the Netherlands, right? They went to the Netherlands. They weren't happy that their children were learning Dutch. They weren't happy that they were being exposed to the Dutch Reformed Church. And so I think your book says they didn't like that their kids were being Dutchified, so they looked for a way to come back to the English realm. They got a charter to go to Virginia, but they got lost on their way and ended up in Massachusetts, Plymouth, right? So both groups are Calvinists. The Puritans had wanted to change the Church of England from within, but when the English Civil War comes around, they end up leaving. Charles II says, that's fine. Get out of here. I don't want any more dissent in my realm than I have to. And so he sends them off to sit up next to their cousins in Massachusetts. and we get the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In order to be a member of the church, in order to have public participation in Massachusetts, you had to be a member of the congregation. And as James was saying, in order to be in the congregation, you had to have had that conversion experience. The Calvinists of New England develop what becomes known, and here's your term, and they use it. In fact, this church becomes the established church, meaning it's being funded by taxes. It becomes known as the Congregational Church. Right? That's a reference to the fact that the congregation had an unusual amount of authority in the church itself, whether that was voting for their ministers and voting for what had to happen in the church, whether it was that in order to vote in colonial affairs, you had to be a member of the Congregational Church, you had to be a congregant of the Congregational Church. It starts to look and be very different from the Church of England, okay? So we give this church the name Congregational Church. Now there's one exception, okay? The people that couldn't hack it, the people that were not religious enough, the people who maybe took their Christianity too seriously. Think about Anne Hutchinson, who believed God had told her that she should minister to other people, yet she was a woman and women weren't allowed to minister. Think about Roger Williams, who criticized the Congregational Church, said basically, we say that we're God's people. We say that we are Christians, yet we mistreat the Indians, right? We allow certain elements of the Church of England to stay in our church here. And he was a bit more radical. Where did those people get sent? Yes, the sewage of New England traveled down to Rhode Island. Okay, and so right away, one of the stories we get here is that because of how radical and how much of an outsider element there is in Rhode Island, they don't establish a tax-funded church. Okay? Now, the official church of England, where's my red pen? Here it is. The official church of England is the Church of England, right? The Anglican Church. And so that element is brought into almost every royal colony and any colony that isn't a religiously oriented colony. So let's think about this. Which of these other colonies were religiously oriented? Okay, what group came, like the Puritans, to try to find religious tolerance for themselves? Think about William Penn and the Quakers. What colony became a religiously tolerant colony because their mission was religious tolerance? Pennsylvania, okay? Pennsylvania and the Quakers ended up settling in New Jersey and Delaware, okay? Those are not going to have institutionalized religion as well. The Quakers were a pretty unique group. They didn't just want, well, they did want religious freedom for themselves, but they were progressive enough to say, look, we can live in peace and toleration of other religions. It was probably because they were pacifists in the sense that they weren't looking to raise an army or to harm anyone in the name of their own religion. They wanted to practice their brand of religion. They didn't always let people vote because of their religious preferences, but they didn't establish a church religion. That means everything else is the realm of the Church of England. Okay? The people of the Church of England, what would you call a person that attended the Church of England? Anglican. Okay? So, now let's analyze patterns here. Let's analyze patterns. It's easy. The Congregational Church was established in all New England states except Rhode Island, right? The Church of England was established in all the southern states and parts of New York City and outlying counties. That's it. Okay. Questions about that? Next question. Yes? Sure. Molasses Act. What is it, 1733? Okay, the date is not as important as the rationale, okay? Molasses. Molasses comes from sugar. Sugar in the British realm comes from where? Well, hold on there. So you're identifying a region. What region of the New World is promoting sugar? Yes, the West Indies is the sugar production center for a bunch of European countries, including England and France. Now, we got the triangle of trade, right? Most of the New World's contributions are raw materials, but there are a few manufactured goods that are starting to develop, okay? Those New Englanders and people in the middle colonies that have been exposed to, for example, the Scots-Irish, they're getting pretty good at distilling whiskey, okay? Rum, like Captain Morgan rum, part of the process is adding sugar, okay? Molasses is a base ingredient for brown rum. And so West Indies sugar is being carted up to New England to be processed into rum. And that's all well and good because the English have colonies in the West Indies, and they're producing the English New England colonies with molasses, okay, as fast as they can. And the crown really didn't interfere with colonial business as long as it was profitable to the empire. But as that molasses business, as the rum business kicks up, the West Indies colonies can't keep up with the demand from New England. So New England, the continental colonies start buying sugar from France, okay, the French West Indies. Now we've got competition between two countries, two empires, right? And the West Indies, yes, the English West Indies planters are going to complain very loudly to the crown that these colonists up in New England are buying French sugar. So Parliament passes a law that heavily taxes French sugar, okay? This is going to make the colonists very upset because now they can't get sugar for a cheaper price. Right? It's going to increase the cost of rum. And you don't want to upset alcoholics, okay? You don't want to make their goods more expensive. So they start looking for alternatives to following the law. There's a big smuggling boom that takes place. So New Englanders subvert the law and continue to get French sugar. And this is where we get into salutary neglect, okay, at first anyway. So this law could have been devastating to the colony's economy, but it isn't because the crown doesn't thoroughly enforce its laws, okay? It just sort of lets the trouble happen. It's too difficult to track down these smuggler ships, right? They passed the law that seems to have placated the West Indies sugar planters, and they've got their hands full with conflict back in Europe. And so we're going to have a period of about 100 years here where the colonies pretty much have limited interference from the English government, the English Navy. So it's going to stay on the books, and keep that in mind because as we come to period 3 here and we look at reasons for the American Revolution, that Molasses Act hasn't gone away. It's just not being enforced. Okay? It's like curfew. Police have better things to do than enforce curfew. Yes?
So basically, England, like back home, doesn't care if they destroy the economy. It's more about like, that's where kind of there's a separation. There's us and them.
I wouldn't say they don't care about destroying the economy, but keep this in mind. What percent of the economy at the turn of the 18th century is the American colonies responsible for? It's about 5%. Okay, so you think about what will eventually be the United States is worth about 5% of the total economy. Now, then they're only importing a fraction of the sugar. And the West Indies, so the West Indies is sending most of their sugar abroad to Mother England. And so the problem really doesn't deal with the whole sugar industry, it just deals with a fraction of it. So they passed this law and it really affects rum makers and merchants that have to pay this tax. Well, the Crown, as a matter of priority, doesn't prioritize enforcing the Molasses Act. And so it really doesn't change much. People initially complain because the law is new, but then they don't see a real big impact on their bottom line because smuggling takes place. And the West Indies, as far as their sugar economy, was not hampered. They couldn't keep up. They had enough business. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so it really became a moot point. Yeah.
I have a question
Okay.
about government.
Okay. Yes, that's something.
The middle New England and southern colonies, like how some of them had like government that was self-centered, like they like voted. I know like the
Right. Let me just do a quick overview of colonial government in general, okay? There are three functions of government. Number one, lawmaking. Number two, after you've made laws, law enforcing. And number three, when there are conflicts over the law, law interpretation. And I'm kind of a visual person when it comes to this. So I'm going to draw some basic elements of lawmaking, law enforcing, law interpretation. And we're going to call the lawmaking branch the legislative branch. Okay? This would be the body that is chosen to make laws for the colonial government. Mr. Bowen and your government teachers next year will get into this and you'll have a head start with this, but Parliament, okay, so many of our colonies modeled their government style off of English model, Parliament. And Parliament is divided into two chambers. This is called bicameral. The lower house, which was elected by British citizens, and the upper house, which was appointed by the Crown, okay? Now, in the British model, who is the top dog in England as far as carrying the law out? The king, okay? This is the executive branch. And we don't usually think of the President of the United States as the top law enforcer, but he is, okay? Laws that are passed are carried out by the executive branch. At the state level or the colonial level, well, that is the governor, okay? I'll call this the Colonial Assembly. And then, of course, to interpret the laws, we have the courts, right? Courts listen to the two sides and then they come to the decision what is legal, what is illegal, what's constitutional, what's unconstitutional. Okay, so there are three branches of government. Now, the claim I made was that the colonies experienced an unprecedented level of participation in their government. Okay, I mentioned back in England, Parliament allowed the average British citizen, that means white men with property, right, to vote and choose people, their parliamentarians, the people that go here to the lower house of Parliament. And the same was true in all of the colonies, had at least one chamber where white property owners, and oftentimes they had to be Christian, right, could elect somebody to go and participate in law making, okay? Now there are colonies that allowed for both, Rhode Island in Connecticut allowed for their citizens, I'm going to put that in quotes because, again, we're only getting white males, propertied Christians. But there were a couple of colonies that allowed for the election of both. But by and large, proprietary colonies and royal colonies, that was it. And that was unprecedented. That's a lot of involvement considering the time. If you went anywhere else in the British realm, you were not seeing colonists participating in their government. And this goes back to the original charters guaranteeing the rights of Englishmen, right? And so this was a product of that. Now that means all the rest of this is not influenced or not controlled by the people of the colonies, okay? The governor was appointed by the king, okay? The governor had a check called the royal veto. What's it mean to veto a law?
To not accept it.
To not accept it. So the colonial governor could veto any law passed by the legislative assemblies, okay? Additionally, the governor filled the upper house. So these people were loyal to the governor loyal to the king, right? And the same was true with the judicial branch, appointed by governor. So you see, we have 2.5 of the 3 branches all working for the king. Does that make sense? So the colonies had to either get along with the crown or they were not going to get their way. Which we have to also accept the fact that the people that were appointed to like the upper house and the courts, they did live in the colonies. So a lot of the laws did reflect the interests of the colonies. The governor lived in the colony, even if he was transported here from England. By and large, the people of the American colonies felt that the laws reflected their interests, okay? But in the case that they didn't, your book talks about how they were pretty smart in trying to control the governor. What did they do? Right. So, and even today in American government, Congress has the power of the purse. That means all bills, okay, all new revenue, if the government is spending money, it has to be approved by the legislative body. And the power of the purse became a really important tool in the colonies because when the governor didn't do what the assembly wanted, they'd refuse to pay him, okay? So even though this isn't an official check on government, at least it wasn't designed to be that way, it became that. And we're going to again see here at the turn of the American Revolution, the British government trying to fix this old problem. We're going to see the Townshend Acts, where the government is going to try to tax things like lead and paint and playing cards and a number of other little ticky-tack things. And the whole point is, oh, well, this money that we get from paint will help pay the governor. And then the colonies can't do this anymore. Well, number one, a tax. And number two, the fact that you're taking this power away from the colonies is really going to anger people. Does that make sense? Because what do we call this 100-year period where things ran the way the colonies wanted them to run? What do we call that? The 100-year period, 17th and beginning part of the 18th century, where colonists could do what they wanted to do because the government wasn't getting too handsy. Salutary neglect. And I keep hammering that not because that's going to be on your test this period, but that it has such a big impact on your test next period. Make sense? You see how the web of these issues start to tie together. Okay. Questions about colonial government. So these appointments, the appointment of the governor, the appointment to the upper house and the judicial branch, that's what would happen in royal colonies. Okay. if you're dealing with a proprietary colony like Pennsylvania, and just substitute proprietors for the king. Does that make sense? So people like William Penn would pick who the governor and the upper house would be, and the judges and that type of thing. There's a group of proprietors, basically investors, that would decide those matters. Okay? Really what I want you to take away from this, though, is this was unprecedented. A little bit, less than a third of control over the colony still felt like a lot to the citizens, white male property owners, oftentimes Christian, in the first 100 years of our existence. And that this system is going to be challenged when we get to the beginning of the American Revolution. Okay? It's also going to be the model for our government. You know, we've got President, Supreme Court, Congress, bicameral Congress, House of Representatives, and the Senate. So this model we still use today. Next question. Okay. I had someone ask me to explain the split between the Congregational and Presbyterian Church. It really boils down to old lights versus new lights. The emotionalism of new lights, you think about people like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, caught on in all denominations. But George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards were Calvinists. They were members of the Congregational Church, or they had been part of that Calvinist group. They both preached predestination. You think about Jonathan Edwards, there's nothing you can do. God's dangling you over the fire, right? You're in the hands of an angry God. George Whitefield was the same way. He was not an Arminianist. And if you remember, Arminianism, that meant that if people believed that God was divine, that Jesus was the Son of God, that would save their souls. Whitefield and Edwards were not Arminianists, okay? But they were passionate, right? They used this preaching style that was strongly emotional. Okay, the Congregational Church divided over this issue. Those that thought this kind of preaching was important, this kind of preaching was good, in the sense that it drew people in. Nobody was getting bigger congregations than Whitefield and Edwards. And so they embraced that, especially in the West, in poorer rural areas where you're finally getting some farmers to show up to church. And then there was the old establishment, the old lights, who thought, no, this is vain, this is sinful, we should not be entertaining people with the word of God. Preachers just got to preach. And those old lights stayed with the Congregational Church, while those new lights set up their own church called the Presbyterian Church. And so it was a break. It was a split. We see this kind of thing all the time today. There are so many non-denominational churches where people got tired of their old denomination because, well, let's take the same-sex marriage issue for an example. Traditional denominations have split over this issue. Can gay people be married in the church? And we see a lot of new denominations or non-denominational churches setting up and saying, hey, we're going to love everyone. That's the mission of Jesus. And we have older churches that are saying, no, the Bible says ... So that's the kind of evolution we're seeing at the turn of the 18th century. And the Presbyterians are the ones that pick up this new light, fire and brimstone kind of preaching. But they're still Calvinists. Make sense? Okay.
I was like, that's kind of.
Yeah. Oh God, this haircut is just.
It looks fine.
Yeah. I'm so pasty too. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, once you get some sun.
Once I get some sun.
Your skin.
Exactly. This is meant for a review time for you. If you don't ask me the questions you're dying to know, I will tell you the questions I think you should be dying to know. So, lay it on me.
Who was your hairstylist?
Cassie from Scotch and Scissors, over in Lakeside Mall area. Yeah, You know where Black Beer and Table is?
Oh.
Or I'm trying to think of what else is over there.
I have no.
Like, so
I
it's like,
don't
it's
On
Wait,
168th and Center.
Oh, you still remember that.
Mhm.
sort of bakers down there.
All right, any other questions besides my haircut? Yes.
On the Ed puzzles, it was a question, and the answer was the people of New England created government founded on democratic principles, which is true and false. I thought theirs was kind of more a theocracy because it was like the Puritans, so that confused me.
Okay. Now, we have to, that's why I asked the question, is to make you think. True, they were theocratic, right? In the sense that religion dictated what their laws were. But you also have to remember, the people voted and participated in making those laws. And this is where we get the influence of the Congregational Church. Part of their founding now, compared to how we are today, we are more democratic than the Puritans were. We allow women to vote. We allow people of color to vote. There's no property requirement, right? Who qualifies as a citizen or an eligible voter is much broader here today than it was in the 18th century. So we are more democratic, but they did institute democratic principles. For example, people that were members of the congregation, so white men that had that conversion experience, could vote on church matters. They could vote on colonial matters, or they got to elect people into that lower house of the colonial assembly. At the local level, let's say the town level, property owners, regardless of their religious identification, could vote on town matters. So New England, even Thomas Jefferson, you probably read this in your text along the way, said that New England was a laboratory for democracy. Okay? But you're right in the sense that they felt their first duty was uphold God's law. And so those would be the way you would be expected to vote, or those were the people, extreme Christian conservatives would be the ones voting. And on top of that, there was no real interest in the participation of women or people of color. So democracy is limited in that way. It's limited in the sense that people without property, poor white men were oftentimes excluded. So it wasn't a quote unquote democracy, but it was democratic in a revolutionary kind of way. Does that make sense? It's always more complicated, isn't it? Yeah.
So
They're like-
both, but like compared to the other, like the South, it's more democratic than the South, but then the middle colonies were like the most democratic.
Right. Well, and the reason we can say that New England was more democratic is we have colonies like Rhode Island, and now probably the most democratic. Well, there were colonies from both New England and the middle colonies, like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, which afforded people the opportunity to vote regardless of their religion. Okay. The reason we would say that those colonies were more democratic than the South is because even though the South wasn't controlled by religion, it was controlled by the landed elite, right? Property requirements were extremely restrictive in the South. Okay? The people that had enough property to vote in the South would have been the planter class, which is about 1% of voters. In addition to that, maybe the farmer class that had enough property to vote, those individuals oftentimes wouldn't vote because there was a culture of deferring to your betters. And so really the South was dominated politically by the planter class. And so even though those planters are voting, even though they have the House of Burgesses or these colonial assemblies, participation makes democracy. Does that make sense? The more participation you have from all people, the more democratic you are. So look at these things as more as a spectrum instead of a binary. Does that make sense? So instead of yes or no, democracy, not democracy, we have shades of gray.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Disney
not
shades.
black and white.
There's a door.
Yes.
I'm not reading mine.
Sorry, it's just too good an opportunity. What were you doing?
Guess what? Also-
Yes.
Okay, why were the West Indies most important to Britain? I thought like all parts of the triangular trade was important to each other, but why were the West Indies
It-
the absolute most?
It boils down to money. At the turn of the 18th century, all of the colonies that would constitute the United States one day were about 5% of the economy for the British realm, where the West Indies, the small cluster of islands in the Caribbean, they were roughly like 8 to 9% of the British economy. And it really comes down to the type of commodity the West Indies were producing, which is sugar, that rich man's crop. And the fact that there were few competitors in the market of sugar meant that sugar kept its price, its premium very high. Also on top of that, the growing slave trade. Sugar and slaves.
They would like to.
Here's the family
The
tree.
new lights moved.
You want me to make a family tree of
With the-
religious
yes.
denominations?
Yes.
That'd be really fun and sad.
Yes.
You love a family tree.
So we get the Church of England, which splits off from the Catholic Church, right?
Yeah.
With Henry VIII. And Elizabeth I makes the Church of England the official established religion of the British realm during her reign, okay? We get a couple of different dissenting groups. We'll call them at first Calvinists because they practiced the teachings of John Calvin, right? With the Calvinists, their big hang-up, like I said, was membership. Yes, they believed in predestination, which led them to believe that the only members of the church should be these people that have a conversion experience, right? So at first, we have participation by the Calvinists in the Church of England. But those Calvinists had different philosophies on how to fix the problem with the Church of England. One group breaks off, and they're going to be called the separatists. Okay? Those Calvinist separatists want to start their own church that will limit membership only to those people that have had a conversion. But James is not about that life, right? He wants to make sure that nobody is challenging the authority of the church and nobody is just challenging the authority of the government. So keep in mind, these separatists also, or the Calvinists also become known as Puritans, right? Because they wanted to purify the Church of England. Those separatists, those Puritan separatists, they get sent off to Holland, and eventually they will become the Pilgrims that venture to the New World in 1620. Okay? The Puritans that stay with the Church of England, they're the ones that stick around and they try to reform the church from within, but they ultimately leave and they set up in Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, right? Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Plymouth Colony eventually become one. As you were reading about the fragmentation of the colonies, the creation of new colonies, and the merger of old ones, I think I said one way to keep this in mind, any colony that was established before 1630, that would be Plymouth and Maine, eventually got consumed by Massachusetts Bay. They merged, okay? So now we've got these two colonies and eventually one colony that's being controlled by Puritans, and because of their emphasis on the congregation has to have experience that conversion. And once they experience that conversion, then the congregation really runs the affairs of the church. They become known as the congregational church. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So they are Puritans. Some of them have ancestors that date back to the Pilgrims. Some of their lines came in 1620, some of those lines came in 1630, some of them came after that, right? But the congregational church are Calvinists. See that? Okay. Now, the Church of England will also play a role in the colonies. Okay? The Church of England, the people of the Church of England are the Anglicans or the Anglican Church. No problem there, right? There are other offshoots of Calvinist groups. So, for example, you should have read or heard about Jacobus Arminius, right? Jacobus Arminius was a Reformed Calvinist. Now, think of it this way, okay? I'm going to give you an example of how this happens, but I'm going to go over here with Arminianism. I want to talk briefly about a hot topic in the church today, which is same-sex marriage. Now, the Constitution, the government of the United States has identified same-sex marriage as a constitutional right. That doesn't mean that churches have to provide a wedding ceremony for same-sex couples, right? That religious ceremony is really up to the church to decide whether they want to practice that, whether they want to allow for same-sex marriage within that church. And it's become a very divisive issue. There have been mainline religious groups that have fractured over this issue. For example, the Methodist Church. There are a lot of Southern Methodist churches and ministers that won't perform the ceremony. There are some Methodist churches that will allow the ceremony. And in fact, there are some Methodist churches that allow gays and lesbians to be clergy in the Methodist Church. And so these issues have fractured the church into two groups. And some people leave the church. There are a lot of people that say, I'm not going to go to a church that doesn't accept who I am. And they leave the church, and we're seeing a lot of non-denominational churches pop up. And those churches then reflect a different kind of theology, and people go to them because they identify with that theology. And so even if they don't call themselves a new denomination, they may call themselves non-denominational. What we see here is an evolution, okay? So the Arminianists, under Jacobus Arminius, they start saying, you know what, this predestination thing is not what God intends. Looking at the language of the New Testament, you know, this idea that people that identify Jesus Christ as the Savior, that will earn somebody redemption. Okay, and so Arminianists, they break away from the Calvinists. In fact, Jacobus Arminius was considered a heretic by his fellow Calvinists. But his theology eventually starts being popular, especially at the turn of the 18th century. People are like, you know what? I don't think that God is really that big of a beehole where he, would say from the beginning of time, these people are condemned and these people are saved. It seems like the message in the Bible is that people put their faith in God, that they earn redemption. And so even though Arminius would not see his theories, his theology come to popularity, this is the backbone of a lot of denominations. So for example, one of the groups that institutes Arminianism is the Methodist Church. Okay? The Lutheran Church.
Oh, yeah.
Adopt that. Okay, now 1 second. So the Congregational Church, about the time of the Great Awakening, this is the center stage for the division between old lights and new lights. Should we have a place in our church for this emotional kind of revivalistic preaching? The old lights say no. That's vain. It's inappropriate. That it takes away from the focus of the Bible and the worship of God, the way that our forefathers worshipped. And in the backcountry, in the more rural areas, and in the places where Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield were having a lot of success, those churches, in adopting that approach, are going to say, yes, no, this is good. Look at our numbers. People are coming back to the Lord. And so when the Congregational Church's leadership meets, there's a real big split. And those traditionalist old lights stay with the Congregational Church, and the new lights establish what's called the Presbyterian Church. And just like every little split, they're mostly the same, but there are elements that are different. And in this case, the initial difference was their preaching style. Does that make sense? Now, the Presbyterian Church and the Congregational churches, they're going to be there's nobody here that exists in a vacuum, totally removed from the influence of others. Eventually, we'll see the Congregational Church lowers its membership requirements. We'll see the Presbyterian Church, be more open and inclusive in who can be a member and that type of thing. But we have in the 18th century, we have two established churches. That means tax-funded churches, and they are the Church of England and the Congregational Church. Those are the two churches that get paid for by taxes in the colonies. Questions? Yeah.
Okay, so.
Question 9/11.
Can we get clarification on Whitefield and Edwards? Because I didn't realize they were Calvinists. I just thought they were a different religion, but then on the ed puzzles they're Calvinists.
Yes, they are Calvinist, and the way you know is, with Whitefield, I more or less told you because we didn't look at any of his speeches, but we did look at Jonathan Edwards. And Edwards, what was different, the reason he wasn't like a traditional Congregationalist was because he was preaching hellfire and brimstone, right? He was very animated. He had that emotional appeal. But if you listen to what he said, everything is about predestination. God has you in the palm of his hand like a spider dangling from a thread over a fire. There's nothing you can do to control your salvation. That was Edwards' message. Whitefield was very much the same way, okay? I think maybe where you're getting confused, or one point that would be worth mentioning, old light versus new lights, okay? The old lights were traditionalists as far as the Congregational Church. They felt like if you're being so animated and so emotional and you are preaching hellfire and brimstone and drawing large audiences to listen to you act, that's vain and that's not appropriate, and that it's not the job of the minister to entertain their audience. And so those were the old lights. The new lights would be like Whitefield and Edwards, okay? That division in the Congregational Church is going to split the church in two. Presbyterians, the new lights are going to become the Presbyterians. The old lights will stay with the Congregational Church. Here's an example I would use in modern context, okay? In modern context, think of the issue of same-sex marriage, okay? Now, putting aside the fact that the court has ruled it's constitutional, churches are still left with the debate as to whether to allow gay people to be ministers, whether they will allow same-sex unions to take place in their congregation. What is the church's stance on homosexuality? And a lot of mainstream denominations have divided over this issue. And so one group of people break off and they start their own church, maybe a non-denominational church, or maybe they call themselves, a traditional church's denomination, but they have a different belief than the mainstream, right? I know like the Methodist Church is torn over that to some degree, whether to allow gays and lesbians to serve as ministers and whether to allow for same-sex marriages in the church. Both view it very differently, and so the church kind of divides on that issue, okay? Now, do you want me to go back further than that, all the way back to the Catholic Church and explain kind of how one breaks off from the other?
No, I think I was just confused. I didn't realize they're Calvinists.
Yes, Calvinism just means that they come from the tradition of John Calvin. And if you think about Calvin, he was all about predestination, but really importantly, the idea that members had to have that conversion experience, right? Time wears that standard down. Even the Arminianists, so Jacobus Arminius was a Calvinist at first, but his theology broke away from that, okay? He's the guy who said, well, maybe God isn't so hateful that he condemned everyone to hell and just a small group to heaven from the beginning of time. The Bible seems to say that if you believe in Jesus and the divinity of Jesus, that is salvation. And so that's kind of the basis for Arminianism. And of course, Calvinists, traditional Calvinists, didn't like that. And so his whole theology didn't get a lot of attention until long after he was dead.